Michael has written poetry since childhood. He has a deep connection with nature, and the practice of shamanism, Buddhism, and Taoism influences on his work. His haiku, haibun, and articles have been published in local and national journals. He enjoys the companionship of other poets through the membership in numerous poetry societies and has been a member of HPNC for 12 years. He lives in the beautiful Sonoma Valley, where he is a docent poet naturalist at Sugarloaf and Jack London State Parks. As a personal life coach, he supports people who want to simplify their lives and who are transitioning into elderhood. And here's Michael.
Hi, folks. It's very good to see all of you today. What we're going to do is explore how Shinto, which is the traditional religion of Japan, has influenced haiku from ancient times until today. Buddhism has also influenced haiku significantly, but that's another subject. And the two have actually influenced each other, but it's way more than what I want to address today. So during my presentation, I'm going to occasionally ask some questions. And because of constraints of time, probably only a few people will be able to answer. We have so many people on the call. And when you do answer, if you'd please keep your comments brief. And then at the end of the presentation, I will ask for questions and comments. We'll take a 10-minute break when you can do some haiku writing. I'll give you the instructions at that time. Then we'll come back and we'll share our haiku, and only one haiku to a person because we have so many people. Maybe everybody will not have a chance to offer their haiku. And please know backstories of the haiku. I realize every haiku has a backstory, but we just don't have time to do that today. So thank you very much. So now here is my disclaimer. I say this at the beginning of every presentation I make. I'm not a scholar. So what I want to share with you really comes from my own personal experience and my own study. And some of what I say might not even be accurate, so that's why I say I'm not a scholar. This is just my personal experience. From a very early age, I identified very strongly with Japan. And though I have never been in Japan physically, my spirit has been there many, many, many times. And when I say many times, I mean in other lifetimes, I'm quite sure. But for the miracle of television and YouTube, I've been all over Japan. I've seen dozens and dozens of Shinto ceremonies. So we live in an amazing time. So that's my introduction. And now I want to go into the presentation. So this first thing I'm going to do is simply to clear the energy. So, first question, animism. How many animists do we have on the call today? I'm going to go to the screen and see. Raise your hand if you're an animist. Wave. We have a few. We do. Let's see the other screen. Yeah, we have a few. Wait a minute. Okay, so for those who do not know what animism is the experience, the direct experience of really experiencing everything from a grain of sand to a galaxy. Everything is alive and everything has a spirit. So in an animistic universe, everything is alive, and all of those spirits can be accessed and directly experienced. Traditionally, this was often done through shamanism in the earlier cultures. And even today, there are many cultures still practicing shamanism. And that is one of the characteristics of Shinto, is that Japanese Shinto actually evolved out of the early Japanese shamanistic practices. And as it developed, it became more and more and more sophisticated until we have Shinto in our modern culture. But its roots go back thousands and thousands of years. I believe that we are all born animists. But because of acculturation, our culture certainly doesn't support that view or experience. And so I do believe that children at a very early age, forget that they have an animistic connection with the world. And for reasons I still don't know, I never lost that connection. And that actually, I have to say, became very problematic living in a culture that doesn't even acknowledge animism or shamanism. I did have, well, numerous psychological problems because of it. But anyway, I just want to share with you my very first animistic memory. It happened maybe when I was 2 or 3 at the latest. I remember walking down the back stairs as a little toddler would do, waddling down the back stairs. And I went over to a row of peonies that were in the yard, and I looked over into one of the peonies, and I immediately saw and experienced the soul of the peony. Now, of course, at that age, I had no idea what I was experiencing, but that's an example of an animistic experience. So I just wrote a haiku not long ago to just capture this experience. White peony, wide with wonder, my mind. So as I said before, I had a terrible time fitting into American culture. As I said in the little breakout view, I do believe that the stork made a horrible mistake and dropped me in this German family in the middle of the Midwest. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, I am positive that I was supposed to be dropped in Japan, but this is the way it is. And so when I was about 13, I discovered the Asian section in the library in Omaha. And I checked out some books of poetry, and I immediately realized the stork's mistake and that I was really Oriental. I was really Asian. And I made the strongest identification from this early time with Japan. And so I sort of needed to create a whole support system for my experiences. And so that's when I started writing poetry, very much in the Oriental style, like Chinese poetry. I had not discovered haiku until much later. And I also became a naturalist, and eventually I became a landscape designer. But I'd like to share one other really pivotal experience about this business of um, uh, the um, uh, the this direct experience of nature uh, and the spirits, particularly the world of the spirits as they relate to Japan. I lived in Boston for a long time, and I went to the Museum of Art, and they had a very, very large exhibit of Japanese artifacts. Many of these artifacts were just everyday things, like um, a fan or an ink stand or a writing desk. And all of a sudden, every single object in the room became alive, and I experienced the spirit that lived in each one of these objects. And each one of these objects, or most of them, actually had poems written on them. And so this was really a turning point for me, because then I realized we actually live in a world of all living spirits, even things that humans create and make, however mundane they may be. These are all living objects, and they have spirits, and we can contact them. And that goes for our computer and our printer and anything else that a human creates. Everything, in my experience, has a living spirit. So I just want to say a little bit more about shamanism, and that is shamanism was the early way that early people contacted these spirits. There was often a principal shaman in a group. Sometimes there were more than one shamans, and they worked in different ways and contacted different spirits. And gradually, in China in particular, uh, these early shamanistic practices gradually developed in what became this extremely highly sophisticated Chinese spiritual science, which is demonstrated in medicine, the I Ching, feng shui, all of the arts. In other words, it is a culture which, I'm not sure if you know this or not. Actually, what I should say is some of you maybe already know a lot of what I'm going to share. But what I want to say is that much of Japanese culture actually was borrowed from China uh, in the early days. And so the two cultures are extremely closely linked. So one of the things about the shamans was that they would access the spirits through rituals and through words of power. So the act of naming is a very, very sacred act. Naming evokes the spirit of whatever it is you're naming. I name a lot of things in my life. I name my truck, I name my computer. I want to get this personal relationship with things in my life. I want to know its spirit. I want to have its spirit speak to me directly. And one of the ways of doing that is to either know its name or give it a name, or with most natural objects like trees and mountains and that sort of thing, if you're open to it, they will tell you their name. They will tell you their true name. You don't even have to think of a name. But that takes some time. Sometimes they don't want to tell you their name, and that's up to them. I never try to pry. So, for example, Gary mentioned Mount Tam. So many people have a tremendous connection with Mount Tam. It is indeed a sacred mountain. And I am one of those persons who has a deep connection with Mount Tam, as I've hiked it many times. And twice over the years, the mountain decided that it was going to tell me its true name. And its true name is not Tamalpais. Its true name can't be spoken in any human language. It can only be perceived. It took me 3 months after that experience to actually perceive the name correctly. It's, how shall I say, so much of what goes on in these realms doesn't go on in English. so you just sort of have to be open to the language of whatever it is that wants to speak. This brings us to Shinto. I want to say a little bit about Shinto. Well, I'm going to say a lot about Shinto. The Shinto is the way of the kami. That is the Japanese name for the gods and the spirits. It's the way of the gods. And as I said before, Shinto arose out of shamanism. And Shinto had a very, very intimate relationship and communion with the land and the kamis and ancestors and spirits that inhabited the land. Shinto shrines are called shrines because they enshrine one or more of the kami, of the gods. Literally, the kami live in the shrine. They often live in an object, like a special stone or a special structure or a piece of sculpture. And so the shrine is actually the living home of the kami. Early on, the kami roamed sort of freely, and very, very early on, the first human interaction with the kami came with, it was actually the beginning of Shinto. There were groves cleared, the ground was cleared in groves of trees, and on the ground was placed the gravel. And the priests or shamans would then invite the kami to come and dwell in that space. And it was considered a sacred space. And it was often roped off with beautiful heavy rope. It developed more and more so that the trees themselves, different, I should say that the kami could actually live in anything, in a tree, in a rock, in a mountain. For example, Fujisan is not just a volcano, a pretty volcano. Fujisan is actually a living spirit. The kami lives in Fujisan. Fujisan is the kami. We don't have anything like that in the West, as far as I know. This relationship, direct relationship with the spirit of natural objects. Let me see, where am I? So actually, an island could be considered the home of a kami, or even a whole province could have its own kami. Sometimes, and I've actually seen several of these ceremonies on television, sometimes a person, a human person, would be cultivated for a year the person was chosen, set aside, and cultivated for a year so that they could then offer their body as the home of the kami during a ceremony. And this was considered an incredibly high honor to be chosen to be groomed so that your body could be the home of the local deity or kami. I've seen so many of these different ceremonies on television, and I have to say, I found them profoundly moving. It is hard for me to ever even put into words what it is I experienced, but the embodiment by a person of a kami was really one of the most remarkable things I think I've ever seen. One of the things about Shinto is that it is very, what I call, it's a local religion. In other words, in Japan, they don't have like a savior kami that saves the whole world. They have, they observe their local kami or the kami of the whole nation. But it's very local. And so for a long time, I really thought that the Shinto was really entirely Japanese and had to be practiced on Japanese soil. But recently, someone pointed out to me that there are several Shinto shrines in the United States. And I should have known that, but I had not gotten that far. So there's one up in north of Seattle, and there is that one north of Seattle is called Tsubaki Grand Shrine of America. It's a very, very major shrine. There are enshrined 6 kami who live there, and one of them is the kami of North America. Can you think of it? I mean, can you get your heart around it? The idea that there is a kami of North America. So there are also a few Shinto churches. One of them is in San Francisco. They are not shrines because they do not house a kami, as far as I know. So that's why they're not shrines. They're called Shinto churches. One of the things I love to do is go to the Cherry Blossom Festival in San Francisco every spring. And I always go on the day when that Shinto church, they build a very big traditional outdoor shrine, and they have a wonderful ceremony, a Shinto ceremony. And as in all Shinto ceremonies, there is a lot of sake. And so part of the ceremony is the breaking open of 2 huge sake drums, wooden cases, and then the sake is given to the dignitaries and then given to the public. And I've been several times to Shinto blessings of a business up in Healdsburg. By the way, the principal priest up in the Tsubaki Grand Shrine up in Washington is actually an American. He is the first American to ever be granted that level of honor. I actually met him several times at these ceremonies, and sure enough, he splashed sake over everything. He went outside and splashed sake on the front of the building and on the tables and on the sidewalk. And he went out into the street and splashed sake all over the street. The whole place just reeked of sake. So I figure that's really very traditional. That's probably part of what they usually do. So let me see, where am I now? So one of the things that I'd like to communicate is that Japan is still a very animistic nation because of Shinto. There are over 100,000 shrines that are both local and national. And there are literally millions and millions of kami. So over the time, all of this this relationship with the kami and nature influenced everything in Japan, everything. The painting, ikebana, poetry, the no play, for example, and the kabuki, the tea ceremony, and particularly garden design. Because remember I said that the first form of the shrine was actually just a grove in the woods with gravel. Well, you still see that to this day in Japanese garden design, the gravel and the stones and rocks in the garden design are often representative of mountains and islands. And all of these rocks are considered sacred, alive, and the garden designer has to know the rock's name in order to be able to place it properly. But the rock doesn't speak English or Japanese. The rock speaks in its own language, and the gardener has to actually know that language and listen to the rock, and the rock tells the gardener exactly how to be placed. I think it's really quite remarkable. Really, though I haven't been to Japan, it seems to me that under the modern veneer, the Japanese culture is still very, very Shinto and aware of the kami and the nature spirits, though maybe not so specifically as they used to be. So how does this all relate to haiku? Well, haiku arose from this culture. There's no way that haiku could not have been influenced by Shinto. Haiku was also very influenced by Buddhism. Um, and particularly in the Kigo, because remember earlier I said that part of the naming was the sacred act. Well, in a way, you could consider that the choice of Kigo is the sacred word. It can be a magical word and connect you to a much greater reality. And so the choice of Kigo sometimes can be, how shall I say, casually, casually thought of, and that's okay. I'm not saying that that's bad, but really, in its deeper levels, the Kigo is actually the sacred word or the sacred phrase. Another thing that I like to say is that the haiku, that's one of the reasons why I was so taken by haiku, is because it is so nature oriented and it has these levels of shamanism that are not really well known. Even in the haiku community, I don't think this connection to the ancient past is really fully appreciated. Anyway, some people, I'm sure, have this awareness. But the haiku can also be about the human condition, because humans are actually part of nature. They aren't apart from nature, they are a part of nature. And so one of my favorite haikus that demonstrate this is the haiku by Shiki. I go, you stay, 2 autumns. I go, you stay, 2 autumns. So what I'd like to do is just take one kigo and look at that through history. And the kigo I'm going to choose is the pine. The pine is a kigo for all seasons. In the Japanese culture, the pine tree is known to represent longevity, good fortune, steadfastness. It is commonly linked with virtue and long life, and even immortality. The pine is iconic of the Japanese New Year as a symbol of rebirth, renewal, and a bright, hopeful future. To my knowledge, this bringing a pine bough or into your house, or nailing it on your door if you can, is still practiced in Japan. Um, though I'm not sure, but this is what I've gathered. Um, the In early times, one of the first abodes of the kami was the pine tree. It goes very, very, very thousands of years back. The pine tree has been venerated as the abode of the kami. And so um, even Isa mentions in his, what is it, The Spring of My Life, he even mentions the New Year's pine. So it is woven through a lot of the culture. But in particular, the pine shows up uh, prominently in many places. For example, in the No play, the back curtain of the No play, as far as I know, is most often a pine tree. Now, I have no skill at making a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to see if this will work. Let's see. Well, it's not. I don't know how to do it. I was going to show you a picture of the backdrop of a no play, but the pine is everywhere, absolutely everywhere, particularly in these more ancient uh, uh, artistic practices like kabuki and the no play. But for me, one of the most personal and most moving examples of how the pine shows up is that Senrikyu, who was a tea master in the mid 1500s, he, though the tea ceremony had been practiced for quite a long time before then in a number of different forms, he brought the tea practice to its modern, very, very sophisticated form, and that form is still practiced to this day. And I practiced tea ceremony with 2 different teachers here in this area. And one of the things that Senrikyo did was he brought everything together. There was the garden, there was the gravel and the stones, and then inside the tea hut, there were flowers. There was a alcove with a hanging scroll with beautiful calligraphy, usually a very pithy Buddhist saying, and the container that was boiling the water for the tea ceremony, that container is called a kame, and the sound of the water in the boiling kame is supposed to be the sound of the breath of the wind of the pines. So in this total silence of the tea ceremony, always in the background is this gentle sound of the breath of the pines. So it was actually quite possibly my favorite part of the tea ceremony. Actually, I myself, a long time ago, made a strong identification with the pine. So my website, my poetry website, is called The Mountain and the Pine. Basho, in his way of haiku, he gave one directive that I took very seriously to heart. And he said, to know the pine, go to the pine. And that's all a person needs to know. He was saying, if you want to write haiku, you have to have a direct experience. You can't sit in your armchair and make up good haiku, though you might fool a lot of people. The real haiku needs to arise from a very direct personal experience. And the deepest personal experience would be to actually encounter and go into communion with the spirit of whatever you're writing about. So here are a couple of haiku that are about the pine. This one is from Basho. The pine wind circling around the eaves, autumn deepens. And another by Anonymous. Inhaling clouds, exhaling clouds, mountain top pines. And another by Taiji. Piercing cold, I drop my broom under the pines. So in conclusion, I just like to say, and this is where I'm getting on my soapbox and becoming very opinionated. So you have to you have to take this with a grain of salt. But this is how strongly I feel about it. We are living in a century that is absolutely obsessed by the personal psyche. And in America, Americans could just turn everything into therapy. And I fear that that has what has happened to a lot of poetry, including haiku, and it's of the times. So I'm not saying that's wrong. That's what's happened and is happening. But I call it haiku and poetry suffering from anthropomorphic creep. And and you might know that our culture, and this is an actual clinic diagnosis, our culture is suffering from nature deficit disorder. It is a legitimate disorder that can be put down on an analysis, a psychological analysis of a patient. And I find that really, really sad. So that's why I feel so strongly about holding on to the tradition in writing haiku, that it be linked to nature because that is the link to the spirit world. So here is another haiku that I just love. It's by Shiki. 2 ears muddied with sermons, the cuckoo. So I'm not actually inviting you to practice Shinto because I don't practice Shinto. But what I've done is I have absorbed a lot of the Shinto, the sensibility, the inner meaning of Shinto. And so I would suggest that you might want to think about this. For example, you can invite a kami to be your companion spirit. You can find a rock or a tree or a neighboring mountain, and you can cultivate a relationship with that mountain. And you can observe it in an animistic way, connecting directly to its spirit, and see what happens. One of the ways that I stay connected to everything is that, I might have mentioned this earlier, I try to name everything, but I also call everything you. I never ever call anything it. And I talk to just about anything I want to as though it were just a human, because it has a spirit and the spirit knows, and often the spirit communicate back. I don't do this in the safe way or on the bus because I don't want to be considered a nutcase, even though maybe some of my friends believe that I am. So if you want to experience the world in this way of living in a world of spirits that you can communicate with, you can do so. You just have to choose to do it. And it might greatly enhance your writing of haiku and your use of the kigo. And that's it. So are there any questions or comments? None?
Yes. Michael?
Yeah. Yes.
Uh, Very interesting. Thank you, first of all. I had two questions. The first is that you referred to at one point during your presentation,
Uh-huh.
rocks in gardens as sacred objects. But then you also, at least I inferred that all objects have kami, have the spirits. So what distinguishes a non-sacred object from a sacred object? That's one question. And the other question is I'm curious to get a little bit more of a sense of that fascinating experience you said as a 2 or 3 year old with the peony, what it was that or your sense or recollection of what it was that created this awareness of and communion with its spirit, its kami.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, the first question, let's take just a rock. The rock sitting in the stream or in the mountain, it has a spirit. If a person would remove that rock, as they do in Japanese gardening, they do it with great reverence and often a ceremony. So they honor immediately the spirit of that rock. And though at that point, they might not consider it yet a sacred rock, but when they place it in the garden, then it becomes a sacred rock. In other words, sacredness is partly the relationship of the human to the rock. However, there are other natural features that are so powerful that they of themselves are sacred and you couldn't move them. For example, you can't move Mount Tamalpais. Uh, and so that sacredness is there in a stable way, and you have to go to the mountain to observe its sacredness. And that is actually one of the things that the mountain told me when it said its name, was that the mountain wanted us humans to start observing the old ways and come to it as a sacred mountain. And of course, that was begun, with Gary Schneider and that circle of people. But what the mountain was saying is, in general, that was a very small population of people. What the mountain was telling me was that part of my mission was to expand this understanding. I do that in many ways. One of the ways I do it is I observe the solstices and equinoxes, and I send out haiku sequences to quite a large network. And that's one of my ways of trying to remind people to keep in touch with these major cycles of nature. I do it in other ways as well. So it's part of my mission. The other thing you ask about the peony, I do believe that we all are born with we're all born with a destiny. And there's more to it than that. But we are all born with a destiny. And each one of us has a unique destiny. Why my destiny was this, I have no idea. I just know that's my destiny. And so of course, I didn't know that for many, many years, but that's what I attribute to the connection with the peony, is that it was my destiny. So does that answer?
Sort of. Definitely the first question, and I'm just wondering what physical or even at that young age, mental or whatever kind of. I'm just curious to plumb the experience a little bit that you had. I mean, it was something that was special, but how did it manifest to you?
Well, the thing is that when I have an experience like this or like that one, it's a total experience. It involves every part of myself, my physical body, my emotions, at that time, my little itty bitty, hardly developed intellect, it involved my, at that time, very rudimentary intuition. And it is really through the intuition that a lot of these things are experienced. But of course, at the age 2 or 3, I had no idea what was going on. Yeah. So does that explain it a bit more?
Yeah. I mean, you used the word communion earlier.
Oh, yes.
And it almost sounds like this was, at least, if not a communion, at least a fully absorbing experience.
Yeah. Well, that's another word that I use to explain it, is it's a communion with something. And what that means to me is that my spirit and its spirit unite for that time, and we actually become one thing, one spirit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like Katha
Michael.
Bella has her hand up.
Huh?
Katha Bella has her hand up,
Oh, okay.
and Helen after that.
Oh,
I admire you, Michael, for trying to talk about it, because I think it's a really hard thing to talk about. It really is experience. Maybe a haiku comes closest to talking about it, but I wanted you to know that when I talk about the Kigo, it sounds a lot like what you're talking about.
uh-huh.
To explain it because I'm leading the Yucateki contest, coordinating it, and to tell people that the Kigo is experience. It isn't a word, it's experience.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
yesterday I had the explanation new that I'd never said before, is that it's like falling in love, where it's all encompassing, it fills your heart.
Yes. Yeah.
So there are different ways of saying it, but it's hard to say because you're always going around it. But the direct experience, but the thing is, what you're saying, everybody has this, and
Yes.
people just feel those feelings that they've had, like what you're talking about. They would probably name moments when it happened. Everybody.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Michael, this is Helen. So I was
Uh-huh.
wondering, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it's kind of discouraged to use anthropomorphism in haiku writing. And yet, if we're ascribing a soul to something, which I find myself doing, I too talk to objects in my life and am afraid of hurting their feelings, such as by dropping them on the floor or something
Yes.
like that. And I apologize.
Yeah.
So if that connection of Shintoism and ascribing a soul to haiku kind of complicates the idea of not anthropomorphizing sometimes the objects that you're perhaps describing or whatever in one's haiku.
Mhm.
So how do you work those two things together or keep them apart?
Yes. So it isn't anthropomorphizing, because that means that you are intentionally laying on something else, total human quality, you see. For example, I have encountered many nature spirits. None of them have human qualities. That's why they don't speak in English or in Japanese. That it's when you deliberately describe a human characteristic or quality to them that it becomes anthropomorphic.
Okay, yeah. Although in
Yeah.
a way, ascribing a soul to things in a way seems to me anthropomorphizing, because a soul can be interpreted as a human concept, at least as far as we're concerned. But anyway, that might be a whole other discussion.
Well, no, I can briefly speak to that. That is one of the great tragedies, in my opinion, of the direction that the Western culture has gone. This ascribing a soul only to humans. And so we've heard this so many centuries that it is assumed that only humans have a soul, and that nothing else has. But in an animistic perception of the world, everything does have a soul.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I think Judith
Yes.
Schellberg. Yeah.
I want to thank you, Michael, and for being so open about this, sharing this talk. I had as a child, I had many experiences like that. They're not as frequent now unless I'm in a natural place like Monument Valley.
Yeah.
I don't have to go to a formal shrine or so on. I call it a spiritual hello from one soul to another. That's the way I've coined it. But I really appreciate it. And I feel in the native peoples here, the Native Americans, they had a similar belief too.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And it's a very rich thing. And haiku helps to develop that. I really feel in many, many ways, haiku has a sacredness to it, as the seasons do, as living things. So I thank you and everyone else.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
And Michael, on the chat, Richard Burns have some question.
Okay.
And oops, I cannot go back. He said something like, "Oh, Richard, can you ask a question? Because I cannot pronounce the word properly."
I'm asking about, do you see any parallels between Shintoism and pantheism?
I never thought about that, but it seems to me there would be parallels, because pantheism means gods, and I don't know exactly what that specifically would mean to different cultures, you know, but that's about as much as I could say about it. What are your thoughts?
It seems like there is a parallel, but there's a difference, I think, in identity of the spirit for an individual creature or object in Shintoism, as opposed to pantheism, which worships nature more as an entity in and of itself, as I understand it. But there seems to be an agreement that it's all encompassing, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, it does.
I like the fact that there's no dominance involved.
Yes, that is a characteristic of the Shinto tradition, is that they don't have a like a pope, or they don't have a single head. There are numerous Shinto traditions. They all seem to get along, though maybe they don't. One never knows. I do know that over the years, Shinto and Buddhism did clash any number of times and didn't get along. But anyway, I think largely they did get along. They influenced each other somewhat. Even as far as I have seen, Buddhist temples in Japan will sometimes have a Shinto shrine associated with them, and they get along quite well.
Prior to COVID-19, the Manzanar pilgrimage every year has a religious ceremony which involves Shinto priests, Buddhist priests, Christian priests, and Islamic priests. It's about an hour and a half long. It's very, very powerful.
Oh, it sounds like it. Where is that?
Manzanar,
Manzanar.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
The their pilgrimage these last 2 years have been on Zoom because of COVID. So
Oh, yeah.
the impact is a little less, but it's still there.
I'm wondering if that the Shinto priest was the priest from Washington.
I don't recall. I
Uh-huh.
think from LA, but I can't say that for sure.
Uh-huh. Was he American or Japanese?
I believe he was American.
Oh, uh-huh. I know there is a major Shinto shrine in LA. I don't know anything about it.
Nor do I.
Hmm.
Michael?
Yes. Mhm.
Another question, I may have the order wrong on this, but it seems I have a vague recollection that having heard that oftentimes in Japan, people will be married in a Buddhist ceremony, but the funeral will be Shinto. Maybe it's reversed. I'm not sure. Are you aware of?
Reverse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Oh, it's-
reversed. Yeah, it's reversed.
Okay. Can you comment on why, or maybe others know better why that would be?
Well, Shinto is all about living on this earth. How do you live on this earth? How do you live with all of these kami? And the Buddhism, anyway, this is what I've heard and read. They say Shinto is for life and Buddhism is for death, because, and that's because Buddhism is very preoccupied with whatever you need to do to get off this earth and go to nirvana. That is a completely, how shall I say, flippant way of describing it. But it gets the point across. So I have a long time felt that that's why the Buddhists, the funerals were always Buddhists. The weddings were usually Shinto, because, and the fact is that Shinto, as far as I've read, actually has sort of an aversion to death. They don't really deal much with death. It's all about how you live on this earth.
But with haiku, you've got both bases covered.
That's right, you do. Yes, you do.
Michael.
Uh-huh. Yes.
I was struck by your discussion of the importance of putting a name on things.
Yes.
And it reminded me of the bards of Northern Ireland and how their capacity to put names on things provided a certain power or a sense of mastery. And they even used that in terms of if someone in the community had an infestation of vermin, they would call the bard who would come and stand on the hill and shout names at the vermin until they finally left. So I wondered if the Japanese interpretation of that power to name also included that mastery, or it was more an investigational aspect of putting something characteristic upon that item.
Gee, I really don't know. Yeah, I really don't know. And actually, I've never heard that before, that the bards did that. In earlier times, I do know that the word was considered generally sacred. In medieval times, for example, the monks who were transcribing the Bible and doing all of these wonderful illuminations, they were speaking as they were writing, because the spoken word allegedly went into the script. So there was not this this is another thing about Western culture that I find quite dismaying, is that we fragmented so many things, whereas in earlier cultures, there was not this level of fragmentation, and particularly with the word. And even the Bible begins, how does the Bible begin?
In the
In the
beginning.
beginning.
Yeah,
Right.
in the beginning. Yeah, was the word. Yeah. So this word was taken very, very seriously. This spoken word, it had enormous power. And I do believe that in the Jewish tradition, well, I know so little about other traditions, but I think I recall that the Israelites were not supposed to speak a certain name of God. It was verboten. You were never to speak that word because it was that powerful and sacred.
It's still true of very Orthodox Jews.
Oh, is it?
Mhm.
Oh,
And you can't write the word God. You'll see G-D written by very religious Jews. Yeah.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
Michael, I was wondering, this is fascinating. Thank you for providing the talk. I'm curious if in your study or experience, you've run across connections with the concept of the mushi. Is that directly related to Shintoism or Buddhism or both? And how would it connect to haiku if so?
And what is your definition of mushi?
Well, my understanding of it is it's considered, I believe it's what Japanese consider the purest form of life, and it takes forms in insects primarily.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, I can't comment because I've never thought about it.
Okay.
Well, what are your thoughts about it?
I just have run across it actually in an anime series that I was watching titled Mushishi. And very interesting approach to life. It sounds very similar to what you're talking about. So I was curious if there was connections.
Yeah, very, very likely.
Actually, the mushi, I know the comic book, you're talking about too. And mushi, original, the word means no selfishness, no self. And the different characters, but the pronunciation of the mushi for insect is the same pronunciation of that. So that's I think that's the story started very interesting way.
Got it. Thanks,
I'm glad you like the comic. I loved it. So.
I love it. Yeah.
Well, that's characteristic of Asian languages, and that is homophones. The same word will actually mean something totally different. We don't really, though we have them in English, we don't really highlight it very much. But it's all over in Oriental poetry. I've read a lot of Chinese poetry, and particularly I've also read some of the early Japanese poetry, the Kokinshu and the Manyoshu, those very, very early collections. And all of that early poetry depends a lot on homophones to understand it. I mean, it's so beyond. When I started getting into it, it blew my mind. The level of sophistication was so beyond what I had ever imagined, Yeah. I must say that of the two, I liked the Kokinshu best. The Manyoshu, how shall I say? Well, this is my own prejudice, but it's an awful lot of love poems. It's like huge number of love poems. You know, I need to say this, and that is the more I learn about Japan and the Japanese language and Japanese poetry, I realize I hardly know anything. Really. you know, I imagine I'm so deeply connected to Japan, but actually, I really often feel like I don't know hardly a thing, you know. Anyway, it doesn't trouble me.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.